Hi everyone, my name is Nick Walterman, and I don't know about you, but I'm feeling 22 as I welcome you formally to this Bloomsbury lecture. Our speaker today is Professor Brandon Polite, and his talk is titled Lessons from Taylor Swift's Re-Recordings and Ontology of Versions. Professor Polite's lecture is part of the wider Bloomsbury series. The series is designed to serve as a vehicle for our authors to help them further contribute to discussions around important social and cultural issues and phenomena. My job is just to act as a facilitator. So I will lay out a bit of housekeeping to begin with, and then I'll get out of the way so that the real host can take over. So the housekeeping is this event is being recorded and will last for 1 hour. It will ultimately appear on the Bloomsbury Academic YouTube channel in the coming weeks. Professor Polite will speak for about 30 minutes, and we will then have a Q&A session after that up until the end of the hour. We ask that you please save any questions for that Q&A session at the end of the talk, and that you use the QA function at the bottom of your screen to ask a question. That's all from me. I'm now going to hand over to Colleen Coulter, who is the real host of today's event. So please take it away.
Thanks, Nick. I'm Colleen Coulter, and I'm a senior publisher on the philosophy list here at Bloomsbury. I'm very pleased to be introducing Brandon Polite, a philosopher who works in aesthetics and the philosophy of music, and who has kindly agreed to give our lecture today. Brandon is the chair of the philosophy department at Knox College. In his spare time, he runs a popular YouTube series where he talks to philosophers about art. He's recently recorded his 80th episode. I've been lucky enough to work with Brandon on Taylor Swift and the philosophy of re-recording. This is an edited book which grew out of conversations on his YouTube series. These particular episodes saw him chatting to philosophers and a music producer about the complicated set of questions that Taylor's versions raise. The book that emerged from these conversations turned out to be the first book-length treatment in philosophical aesthetics of a woman songwriter and performer. And this tells you everything you need to know about the history of publishing in aesthetics. As part of today's talk, we're offering a 35% discount off the book. The code is Taylor22, and you can find it in the chat. This is good until the end of May. You can also now relax knowing that the password is my only reference to a Taylor Swift lyric. In this collection, Brandon brings on board some of the most exciting thinkers in aesthetics. His role as editor and conception of this book demonstrates why he stands out in a subject often accused of being traditional and removed from our everyday interests. Far from being out of touch or humorless, his practice of philosophy is engaging, keyed into contemporary aesthetics, and serious without being overly self-serious. It's not philosophy for the few, here is philosophy for all. For Brandon, the philosophy of music is not limited to classical musicians or the gods of rock. He shows us how thinking about Taylor Swift's re-recording project offers the chance to see what philosophy looks like at its very best. Relevant and compelling, he creates the necessary space to think again about what you thought you already knew. But rather than me tell you anything more, please let me introduce you to Brandon Polite and the lessons we can learn from Taylor Swift's re-recordings.
Awesome, Colleen. Thank you so much for that incredible introduction. I hope I can live up to it even partially. I should say at the outset that the book that Colleen mentioned, which is right behind me, wouldn't have been possible without her guidance throughout the process from proposal till the editing process. So I need to thank her absolutely, and of course all of the contributors. My talk today is going to be stemming from my chapter, and so I'll talk about that, but first let me introduce the issue. Okay, so let me get the screen to move. There we go. Okay, so I'm talking about versions, right? Taylor's produced versions of her tracks, versions of her albums, and so what does it mean for an artist to produce a version or something? What are the natures of these things? And so here are some versions of works of art. We have Hamlet existing across 2 quarto and the first folio edition. We have here 3 cuts of Ridley Scott's Blade Runner. There are actually 2 others that have been officially released. We have 2 editions of Frankenstein, the original from 1818, and then we have the 1831 edition, which is severely revised. version of that album. So we're pretty familiar about artworks existing across multiple versions. This is true of things beyond art, right? Games exist in multiple versions. There are multiple versions of poker, for example. There are multiple rule sets for Uno. Thinking about recipes, cocktails, dishes exist across versions. So we're familiar with things existing in versions, but there hasn't been a lot of metaphysical work devoted to thinking about versions, how they're related to each other, et cetera. And so here's some more versions thinking about the gods of rock and roll. Let It Be exists across at least 4 versions. We have the official release from 1970. We have 1969, a bootleg mix by Glyn Johns called Get Back, which contains a different track listing, different takes, very different mix. We then have from 2003 the Let It Be Naked version, in which Paul McCartney supervised the redoing of the album to the way he wanted it versus Phil Spector's version, which McCartney hated. And then we have the 2021 special edition, which is really just an enhanced audio version of the officially released original album from 1970. So more versions. And of course, we have Taylor's versions. For those unfamiliar, Taylor Swift's record label, Big Machine Records, her first record label was sold to Scooter Braun, among other things, Kanye West's former manager, in 2019. And in response to this, Swift decided she was going to re-record her albums, producing more or less duplicate versions that could take the place on the marketplace of the originals to deprive Scooter Braun of potentially millions of dollars in sales and licensing royalties, etc. The project, for anyone unaware, has been hugely successful. All 4 of the re-recordings debuted at #1 in the year 2023. The #1 album was 1989, Taylor's version. The #3 album was Speak Now, Taylor's version. And for good measure, the #2 album was Midnights, also by Taylor Swift. And so this project has been hugely successful economically, politically, and I think artistically, aesthetically. A lot of people have commented on how the new versions sound better than the originals, both in terms of production, but also in terms of the quality of Swift singing, although some people prefer the originals, especially Fearless and Red and Speak Now, when she just sounds younger. Some people prefer that, whereas others prefer how she sounds now. But the point is, she's produced versions. So lots of versions, lots of versions, lots of versions. So let's think about versions. And I'm not going to read through this, but thinking about the types of art I've looked at already, popular music, film, and literature, right? There are all sorts of versions. We have early versions, right, of demos or rough cuts or drafts or rough studio mixes of albums. We have sort of officially released like first editions, right, of the finished studio mix, of a theatrical cut of a film, of first edition. We further have, all sorts of subsequent mixes. An album released originally in mono can subsequently be mixed for 2-point stereo, 5-point stereo, 7-point Sony Atmos, et cetera, right? With respect to music, we have radio edits, we have clean versions, we have remixes of various sorts. And in Taylor's case, we have re-recordings. And so it seems that works of popular music, as well as film and literature, exist across all sorts of versions. And so part of what I'm going to do today is think through the ontology of this, right? What are the nature of these versions? How do they relate to one another, et cetera? And so, as I just said, my questions are, how do all of an artwork's various versions relate to one another? And further, what are they all versions of? As I just said, they're versions of an artwork. Well, what the hell is that thing separate from those versions, which seem to be artworks of their own? And so that's precisely what I'm going to talk about. Okay, so in the book, which again is behind me, but here's a better shot of the cover, Taylor Swift and the Philosophy of Re-Recording, the Art of Taylor's Versions, which was released in January of this year, just, 3-ish months ago. There are 9 chapters that focus on the legal, metaphysical, ethical, social, political, and aesthetic dimensions of Taylor Swift's project of re-recording her first 6 studio albums. Not just because I'm editor, I highly recommend checking it out. It's a really great book. I'm teaching it in a class right now, and the students are absolutely loving it. And I think not just because I edited the thing and wrote one of the chapters, but my chapter was on metaphysics, and that's the topic of my discussion today. And so let's get into the metaphysics of re-recording. And so the question I ask in my chapter in the book, which again is the main chapter on metaphysics in the book, is does re-recording her albums allow Taylor Swift to literally reclaim them? There's a typo there. Ignore that. That is, produce genuine instances of those albums that are legally hers. And so to answer that then requires answering the more basic question of, are Taylor's versions genuine instances of the original albums? Or are they instead distinct works of art? Because if they're distinct works of art, then she's not producing instances that are legally hers, and thereby she's not literally reclaiming those albums. Right. And so with respect to that second question, it depends on how we conceive of albums. Right? If albums are conceived of as merely collections of songs, then ignoring the bonus from the vault tracks, because each Taylor's version has bonus tracks at the end, which are new recordings as well. If we conceive of albums as collections of songs, then it would seem like, yeah, she's produced a genuine instance of the album, right? Same track listing, same songs, same words, same melodies, they sound the same. So it seems like we should consider them the same albums. Boom, done. She's reclaimed them. Awesome. Of course, it's not that simple because things rarely are. Here are 2 albums that are the same collections of songs. Taylor Swift's 1989, and from a year later, Ryan Adams' cover version of 1989. Same songs in the same order, same words. Adams covering them does sort of indie alt rock versions of them, whereas Taylor, her version, the original version of the album is very hard synth pop. If we are to conceive of these 2, of 1989 rather, as a collections of songs, then these are the same album. Right? The implication of that then would be that Ryan Adams has somehow claimed 1989 by producing his version, which is just the same collection of songs. This seems problematic, and not just because of various allegations against Ryan Adams, which set that aside. It doesn't seem like one could claim someone else's album just by producing a cover version of it. Like, that's problematic. And so if we instead think of albums as collections of tracks rather than collections of songs, then the answer is no. And that's the answer I give in the chapter. And so within the philosophy of music, and in particular within the area of philosophy of music that looks at popular music, as philosophers argue, so Ted Graysick, Andrew Kania, and so forth, the central foci of aesthetic and critical attention are recorded tracks. Tracks are recordings. Most of us should be familiar with the fact that tracks are typically composed of a number of separately recorded parts that have been stitched together, layered together, and mixed together into a single unified sonic object. And if you're interested in the process of that, check out chapter 4 of the book behind me. Michael Thomas Connolly is a music producer, sound engineer, and musician who goes through the process of how recordings are made and thereby how re-recordings are made. It's a really awesome chapter, so definitely check that out if you're interested. Um, a track then is a studio constructed representation of a performance of a song. So songs within the philosophical literature are thought of as ontologically thin, meaning that they specify very little of what it takes to produce a genuine instance of them, right? It's basically a general chord progression and lyrics is basically and vocal melody. That's basically all a song is. And you can arrange that in various different ways, change different things, switch genre, etc., to produce genuine instances of songs. And so Ryan Adams is producing genuine instances of Taylor's songs um, by arranging them differently, right? But melodies are roughly the same, the lyrics are roughly the same. He's just performing it in a different style, slightly different arrangement. And so he's produced genuine instances of the songs, but he hasn't produced instances of the tracks because tracks are recordings, right? They're objects, they're sonic objects that have particular histories. Which means that the tracks then are ontologically thick, whereas again, songs are ontologically thin. Um, Okay, so in my chapter, I argue that a track's identity depends on two things. First, its production history, and second, its release history. So on the production history side of things, um, as I said before, thinking about these two albums in terms of their tracks, the tracks are recorded by different artists, by different production means, right? They have different histories. Ryan Adams's tracks are based on Taylor Swift's tracks, whereas Taylor Swift's tracks are based on songs that she wrote. They're produced at different times with different intentions, right? Whatever Ryan Adams's intentions were in producing a cover version are different than Taylor Swift's in producing that album. And so therefore they're different tracks. And this is just, tracing from Ted Graysick and Gerald Levinson, and just the thought being that artworks are individuated at least in part, and works of music in particular are individuated at least in part by their causal histories, right? These two albums have different causal histories, therefore they are different albums, right? Um, but what about Taylor's version of 1989? Right? Same artist. They sound roughly the same. The production may be slightly different on at least some of the tracks, but they sound pretty much the same, right? Why aren't they one and the same album? Well, the same sort of reasoning applies as it did to the case of Ryan Adams's 1989, right? Despite the fact that both of them are featuring Taylor Swift, they have different production means, right? The production means for producing 1989 Taylor's version were looking back at the original version and trying to reproduce those tracks as faithfully as possible. They're produced at different times and different intentions, right? Taylor Swift's 1989, her intentions would have to do with, expressing herself, something about herself and her life at that particular time in 2013, 2014. Whereas the intentions behind 1989 Taylor's version are different. It's a form of self-expression, but it's form of self-expression in response to the bad position that she's been put in as a result of losing out on the ability to acquire her original albums, and the fact that they were sold to her arch nemesis within the music industry. And so they're different tracks, and thus conceiving of albums in terms of collections of tracks, they're different albums. Um, Okay, so I also argue that a track's identity depends on its release history. And in doing so, I'm following Darren Hudson Hick, who wrote the first chapter of the Taylor Swift book, and he's exploring in that chapter the nature of copyright and suggesting that our copyright laws are really problematic and should be changed in order to allow for greater justice within the music industry. So check that chapter out. But Darren, in a separate paper from 2008, argues that uh, briefly that we can't know for sure when a work of art is finished. It's vague as to when an artist finishes a work. However, the fact that artwork has been released means that it's been finished. As a result of that, any changes done to a work of art after it's been released and then it's released again leads to it being a distinct work of art. And so the fact that 1989 and 1989 Taylor's versions have different release dates, and the fact that she made various changes, and not merely various changes, she re-recorded the whole thing, indicates that the tracks appearing on those albums are different, and therefore they are different albums. They're ontologically distinct works of art. And so that follows for all of the Taylor's versions, right? They're all sets of different tracks, therefore they are different albums, because albums should be conceived of not in terms of collections of songs, but rather as collections of tracks. So, re-recording doesn't allow Taylor Swift to produce genuine instances of the albums that are legally hers. However, it does allow her to produce versions of them that are hers. And I argue in the chapter, so that people don't get really depressed, that the fact that she doesn't literally reclaim her albums is not a problem, right? The metaphorical reclamation that she's doing by producing versions, not instances of the albums that are hers, is far more powerful than if she were to somehow ontologically regain the albums, through re-recording them. Now, obviously, if she could buy the albums, the masters for the originals, that would be one thing. But re-recording them doesn't provide a means of reclaiming the masters and thus reclaiming the albums. Okay, so now I'm going to move past what I argue in the chapter to what I'm thinking about now. And I'll say at the outset, my thoughts here are really sketchy. And so any suggestions, any feedback, any help you could give me would be greatly, greatly welcome. But this is extending beyond what I argue in my chapter. Okay, so going back to this slide from much earlier, within popular music, we have a bunch of different kinds of versions of tracks and albums. With films, we have all sorts of versions of films. With literary works like novels, plays, etc., we have all sorts of versions, and we're used to thinking about these art forms in terms of versions, and we engage with works of art within these mediums through engaging with their versions. And so I want to think more about the nature of versions here. So going back to the 4 versions of the Beatles' Let It Be, right? With the bootleg Glyn Johns mix, we've got a different track listing than we have on the official 1970 release mixed by Phil Spector, right? The tracks, not only is the track order different, there are some tracks on Get Back that don't appear on Let It Be and vice versa. Those tracks further on Get Back are produced from different takes, and it's a different mix, right? And so there's a question of whether it's a different album, right? The tracks were all produced during the same recording sessions, so it's historically apt. They have the same causal history. But it seems like the fact that the tracks are different, the takes are different, the mix is different, may be enough to indicate that it's a different album. And ditto with the 2003 Let It Be Naked version of the album, right? The track listing is different. There are tracks that appear on it that do not appear on the officially released 1970 version of Let It Be. Similarly, the tracks are made up from different takes, right? There are different recordings that appear on Let It Be Naked, and the mix is different, right? And so the question there is, are those enough to indicate that the album's different? Whereas the 2021 remaster has the same track listing as Let It Be. It has the same takes as Let It Be. The mix is different. Giles Martin, George Martin's son, used artificial intelligence and powerful software to allow for audio separation, which allowed for extremely high quality mix, not just in 7 and 9-point stereo, but also in Sony Atmos, which has something like 72 channels or something like that. And so again, the track listing is the same, the takes are the same. It's just the mix is different. And so should we think of this as a different album? And here's what my thinking is. And again, my thinking is sketchy, so please let me know what you think. Looking at these two, right, the original and the remaster, right, are they different albums or are they instead different ways of accessing one and the same album? I think it's the second. I think that they are two different ways of accessing one and the same album. Or maybe another way to think about it is the remaster gives us a new way to access the original. I think I'm not committed to that one. I don't love that one. I'm instead inclined to think that these are actually two different ways of accessing one and the same album. And thus that albums and the tracks that comprise them can exist over and above particular mixes, right? All we do here that's different, all we have here that's different is a change in mix. And so that seems to indicate that they're two versions of the same album. So an album is something that stands behind a mix. And that makes sense if we think about how albums are released today, right? Any of Taylor Swift's albums being released today are released both on physical media, so analog media, so vinyl. Taylor's the number one seller of vinyl in the US, at least right now, perhaps the world right now. Um, and it's also released digitally, right? MP3, streaming, etc. Analog mixes and digital mixes are different mixes, right? Those masters are different. And so that suggests that the album, whatever it is, stands behind those distinct mixes. Because otherwise, it would follow that listening to, say, 1989 Taylor's version on vinyl would be listening to a distinct work than listening to it on analog. And that seems false to me. Um, and so what further follows from this is that we hear albums and tracks through their mixes, right? Again, albums and tracks exist over and above. They stand behind mixes, and they are what we hear in or through their mixes. And so to use fancy philosophy lingo, right, they're the intentional object of our aesthetic experience. It's not the sounds themselves as encoded in particular mixes. Rather, it's something we hear in or through the sounds is what we're attending to. Um, and so while Let It Be Naked and Get Back, the bootleg of Let It Be, trace back to the same historical events, they're composed of different takes and they have different songs on them. And so they are different albums composed of different tracks. They're just different tracks, right? They have the same genealogy, but they trace back to different moments in time, right? Track one versus track two, even though they're part of the same recording session, those are distinct moments, distinct parts of that recording session. Um, so how I want to think of these as they're distinct works. However, they are versions of the album, which is pointing to something else that I'll get into momentarily. Um, Thinking then about re-recordings, right? Because here we have remixes and taking previously recorded material and doing something different with it, which also can occur in film. And so think about like the director's cut of, or director's cuts, plural, of Ridley Scott's Blade Runner, right? In all of those, he's taking pre-recorded material and arranging it differently and changing it in various ways. In, say, dropping the voiceover from the original and editing things in, taking things out, etc. Right? That's also an instance of composing ontologically distinct films from pre-existing recorded material. They're distinct films, they're distinct works of art, and yet they're versions of one in the same film, one in the same movie, namely Blade Runner, whatever that is. So thinking about re-recordings then, right? In recording the full version of All Too Well, which gives us as the last track rather on Red Taylor's version, the beautifully named All Too Well 10-minute version, Taylor's version from the vault. In recording the full version of that song for the first time, what Swift revealed is that the song as it appears on the original Red was actually an abridged version of the song. And this is something she alluded to for years, and it was ultimately fan demand that led her to record the full version of the song. But in doing so, it was revealed that we had on Red from 2012, that version of All Too Well is abridged, right? And then when she records the Taylor's version of All Too Well on Red Taylor's version 9 years later, um, we have a brand new recording of the abridged version of the song, right? And then with the 10-minute version, we have the full song, and the full song adds instrumentation. It has a different vibe than the original, and um, to the point where I think at this point, All Too Well, the 10-minute version has become the canonical version of the song. When it was released as the lead single to Red Taylor's version in 2021, it met universal acclaim among critics. Lots of critics said this is the best song that Taylor Swift ever produced. In terms of writing, it's the best song she ever produced in terms of the quality of the recording. Um, uh, Fans love it as well when she performs it live in the Eras tour. She's typically performing the 10-minute version. And so there's a sense in which the real song, not the real song, the full song appears in the 10-minute version, and then an abridged version appears on both as the official track 5 of Red and then of Red Taylor's version. Um, Okay, so I forgot that the slide was next. Um, okay, so uh, how I'm wanting to think about this then, right, as I just previewed and shifting to the Beatles, let's get back to the Beatles. Sorry, that was a pun. Um, is inspired by Charles Stevenson and Joseph Margolis. Stevenson and Margolis, writing in the late 50s, were concerned specifically, at least Stevenson was concerned specifically with translations of poems, right? And the question is a translation of a poem an instance of the poem, or is it something else? And what he ends up arguing is that translation of a poem is a version of the poem, and really, the original poem and its translations are versions of one and the same thing, right? So the poem is this more abstract object that stands above the original and its translations. Joseph Margolis, a couple years later, develops that thought further and thinks actually every work of art is like this. He wants to include painting in here, which I find peculiar. I wouldn't go that far. And of course, he's writing before, say, Goodman's Languages of Art and other um, stuff, but whatever. The thought there is that when an artist produces a work of art, they don't just produce that object, but they produce a more metaphysically abstract object at the same time, from which all of which versions belong to. That was a terrible sentence. I apologize. Right? It allows for versioning, basically, of works. And so we have this really complex-ish thing that I made as best I could in PowerPoint, where if we conceive of an album as a track collection, right, a collection of tracks, then Let It Be, Let It Be Naked, and Get Back, right, are targeting one and the same album. They are versions of that higher order collection of tracks. Um, and that, I'm realizing now that language might not be helpful, so please help me with this. But we have Let It Be, and Let It Be, as indicated earlier, exists in the original mix and the 2021 remaster, right, which is a remix. Right, so that album exists across multiple mixes, and each of those has multiple copies. So if you're familiar with how philosophers and metaphysics talk about these things, we have types and tokens, right? And so the tokens are going to be the copies. Above those tokens, we can have mixes as lower order types. Beyond that, we can have a particular album version like Let It Be. as a higher order type over and above the mixes as lower order types. And then above that, we have an album of which Let It Be, Naked, and Get Back are also versions, right? So we have, whoops, that's not what I wanted. We have the track collection. Below that, we have this lower order type, below which we have two subtypes, and each of those has copies. And so importantly, to listen to a copy of either mix, I'm wanting to argue, is a way of accessing this version of the album, right, of Let It Be, versus listening to copies of Let It Be Naked does not give you direct access to that version of the album, which is Let It Be, which stands above the versions and above the mixes and copies. I hope that's clear. Thinking about it in terms of songs then, and the thing I'm wanting to add here is that philosophers of music who think about popular music, as I mentioned earlier, think about really two entities. They think of songs and they think of tracks. They're also performances, which I'll get to in a second. But those are the two things they're thinking about, and I'm wanting to complicate that picture by adding at least two other objects, right? So if we think of albums as song collections, we can produce that via recordings, but also in live performances. I could take this crappy kid's classical guitar behind me and just do a full run through of Taylor Swift's 1989. And if the album were a collection of songs, I would have produced a version of that album. That seems the wrong way to think about it. But importantly, we have songs as these ontologically thin things that are relatively easy to produce instance of, and they track along the lines of recordings and live performances. Live performances can exist according to various arrangements, and then below arrangements, we have particular performances, right? So I could come up with, say, a particular arrangement of Taylor Swift's style, and then perform night after night at open mic after open mic my arrangement of style. Other people could cover my arrangement of style and thereby cover Taylor Swift's song. But on the album side, which is the main thing I'm interested in, right? We have the album, whatever it is, it's between the song and the particular versions, right? The album is a collection of songs, which is a collection of tracks, but each of these, in some sense, targets the tracks and trying to reproduce the best version of the album. And so the album, whatever it is, stands over and above the particular versions. And then below those, you can have mixes, which are versions of those versions. And below those, we have particular copies, which can then be played back on various formats, vinyl, cassette, digital, etc. And I want to note too, I want to note too that this thought is partially inspired by a paper that P.D. Magnus published in 2016 on this jazz, I think trio, maybe quartet, who re-recorded a note for note duplicate of Miles Davis's Kind of Blue. And Magnus suggests, but doesn't argue for the possibility of what Miles Davis has actually done in producing Kind of Blue is also produce this higher order type, which is what I'm identifying as the album. And so Magnus suggests that, and so I want to give him credit, and that's a thought I need to develop further. But Magnus, by the way, is one of the co-authors for Chapter 2 of the Taylor Swift book on thinking about Taylor Swift's re-recordings through the lens of cover versions. And so check that out too. Okay, I'm going to stop talking now. There are my references. And thank you all so much for listening.
Thank you so much for such a rich run through of all the things that we can think about when we think about Taylor Swift's re-recordings. If you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A function. That's the only way you can ask a question. We can't see raised hands, so it's the Q&A button. I can tell you that we've got a question so far, and this is from Sarah Barnsley. Hello, Sarah. She says, fascinating talk. I'm sure you've thought about this, and it's probably in the book, but I'm curious about the usefulness of approaching the question of versions through the lens of poetry, which of course you touched on. Taylor often refers to herself as a poet as well as a musician, singer. And in poetry, there is a common idea that a poem is always a non-finite entity, e.g., Paul Valéry's famous saying that poems are never finished, only abandoned. Again, you mentioned that Darren Hudson Hicks' work, and also this idea that many poets rewrite poems after they've been published. Marianne Moore is an exemplar here. How might this lens expand or complicate the physical ideas that you're raising? And she wants us to know that she's not a philosopher, but a poetry critic and a poet.
Awesome. Thank you. I really appreciate that question. And I wasn't thinking about it in terms of poetry. I was thinking about it in terms of novels, but obviously I think the connection there is relatively clear, right? The one I mentioned was Frankenstein, right? Which we have the original 1818 edition, and then Mary Shelley pretty seriously revises it seemingly in response to Victorian criticism of it being a bit too radical and a bit too dark. And so she revises it in the 1831 edition. And of course, this is relatively common. I think George Eliot revised Middlemarch multiple times. Um, uh, and this is something too that we see in film, right? George Lucas just can't stop tinkering with the original Star Wars trilogy, right? When it came on Disney Plus, he added Greedo saying a line, right? Like, dude can't let it lie. And so I really like the thought then of there's a sense in which artworks aren't finished. But at the same time, I think that I'm inclined to agree with Darren Hick, who I mentioned, who thinks that the question of when a work of art is finished is something that a few philosophers of art have dealt with. The literature is pretty small. It's Paisley, Livingston, Lee Craig, Guy Rohrbaugh, and Darren Hick, basically. I've now contributed to it with my chapter where I just said Darren's right. But I think Darren is right that once you've released a work of art, there's a sense in which it's finished, right? Even if you then subsequently make changes, you have thereby produced a new work of art. And the thing that I'm wanting to think through is precisely how are those works of art related to one another? And I think that appealing to the Stevenson notion, the Joseph Margolis notion of there being higher order types that those works are all versions of, is a plausible and perhaps helpful way to think about it, right? Because they're clearly related to one another historically, right? The subsequent editions, the subsequent versions, the revisions, etc. They're clearly related to one another, and they all exist simultaneously, right? That you can, right now I could read. I've got it behind me, right there. I've got the 1818 edition of Frankenstein, right? And so the same thing is true of poems. You could look at multiple editions, revisions of a poem. They all exist. Ditto with films, right? All of Ridley Scott's cuts of Blade Runner exist on the Ultimate Collector's Edition DVD. And so they all exist. And the question that I have is, well, how should we think of them? And how I want to think of them as distinct works of art that are somehow versions of this higher order work of art, but then teasing out the nature of whatever the hell that thing is the thing I'm having difficulty with. But I totally appreciate where you're coming from. And it's I think, a really helpful suggestion, and it offers another avenue for thinking about these things. So thank you.
And yeah, and here's another avenue as well when we were thinking about versions. And this is from Georgina Merriman Hoffman, who asks, can I ask for your thoughts on the way the versions of the song develop change over the course of live performances? The crowd chants and mashups from the Eras tour, for example, which I think is a great question because it then touches on the power of the fans, which of course is exceptional here in terms of how the versions have succeeded.
Yeah, I love that question. So thank you. And importantly, songs evolve over time, right? And that's something that Michael Thomas Connolly talks about in his chapter in the book, is how the standard model or like the standard image we get in media, in like film and TV is you have the young aspiring artist. They've written the song, they take it into the studio, they then bang out that version of the song as it appeared in their head, and then it's recorded, it's released, they get famous, they go on tour, and they produce a more or less faithful version of that song live, right, in performance. And we know that that's not how things work, right? That through the process of songwriting, through demoing, and then through recording, the nature of the song changes, right? And I included in the PowerPoint within versions of songs, films, novels, etc., drafts, right? And so you have early drafts of things, right, that evolve and change. And then when you record it and then you release it, you've in some sense fixed it, right? That at this moment, this is what I think the best version of this song is, right? And that's how Michael talks about it in his chapter, which I think is right. But then, as the question is pointing out, artists change their songs further over time, right? It evolves, it changes. Fans lead them to do certain things. They can mash songs up, or at least do various medleys of things. And uh, so the songs then, I guess the point here is that the songs are separate from the recordings, right? And the songs exist in the recordings, but they also exist in live performance, and the songs evolve over time. And so there's nothing to prevent Taylor Swift from going forward, recording a new version of the song,
Mm.
right? I think about Radiohead's True Love Waits is a song that I think that's the song I may be forgetting because it's been a while since I've listened to A Moon-Shaped Pool, their latest album, which is probably a decade old now. Um, uh, I think it's True Love Waits. That's a song that they'd performed live and demoed numerous times throughout their career, like for probably at least 20 years. And then finally they put it on an album, right? So then there's the official release of the song, but there are all these other versions, both live and recorded, studio recorded, that exist out there. And presumably, if they perform it live subsequently, because apparently they're planning to go on tour again, it's going to change and evolve as well. And so we just have all of these live versions which change it. And so, I think one way to think about it is, okay, the song is something that evolves over time through live performances. The recording is a snapshot of that, but it doesn't necessarily halt the evolution of the thing.
Yeah, yeah. And how much do you think something like nostalgia then clouds our judgment of versions? It's all very well talking about it in sort of PowerPoint fashion, but what
Yeah.
about that first time? How important is that?
I think that it's important. I mean, so there's a couple issues here, right? There's the how we respond to the thing, right? And so our emotional response or aesthetic response and the relationship nostalgia has to it. And that's something that Irena Martinez Marin argues for in her chapter in the book, which is precisely about the fans' relationship to Taylor's versions. And as she points out, and this has occurred through a lot of the criticism when Fearless Taylor's version, Red Taylor's version, et cetera, Speak Now were released, that her voice sounds different. And some people find that eerie, right? It gets into uncanny valley territory. And so if you grew up listening to and loving her albums, and then you're going to stop listening to those and listen to the new version that sounds mostly the same but slightly different, right? It might not trigger nostalgia in the right way. And so you may have a harder time engaging with it and enjoying it. And so on the enjoyment side, nostalgia is a part of it. But then I think there's a further question, which Alex King touches on in her chapter about the meanings of these songs, right? And the fact that the meanings of them, which the authors of chapter two, PD Magnus included, deny, the meanings of the songs can actually change over time. And Alex argues in her chapter that the meanings change as a result of being re-recorded, at least some of them. And I think the same is true of live performance, right? That the songs can change their meaning as a result of being performed live. And I think this is something that Taylor Swift has actually said. It's, thanks to you, the fans, this song that was originally, about heartbreak and left me felt heartbroken. Now I feel empowered,
Mhm.
right? Which means the meaning at least for her, has changed. And actually, going way back in time, this is something that Eddie Vedder said on what was the show on VH1 where like I forget what it was called. Anyway, but like bands or artists would perform and then talk about their songs, right?
Mhm.
And Eddie Vedder is talking about Alive, right? And Alive is about the fact of learning that his dad was dead, right? That his the guy he thought was his father wasn't, and his real dad had died, so he can never really have a relationship with him. Um, and the chorus of I'm alive, he wrote it as a curse, right? That like this is a curse for himself, and yet through fans singing it back to him, the meaning transformed from this curse to something, positive, that enabled him to like heal in a way, which is, I think something that Taylor Swift is describing too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And that role of evolution is fascinating as well when you think about the recent film of Bob Dylan that's just come out, because now
Yeah.
you see that history and how we interpret it now and the difference. So yeah, I mean, there's so many different angles you can go here.
Yeah. Yeah.
I've got a great question from Nick, which is, does a work of art only become a work of art once it is released? For example, if Taylor had recorded her tracks for 1989 but never released them, would they still be works of art? What if literally nobody listened to them? Would they still be works of art in that case?
Yeah, good. And so I think on Darren Hick's view, right, to go back to that, if they're unreleased, we just don't know whether they're finished,
Yeah.
right? And so it's for Hick, it's the act of releasing a thing that guarantees that it's a finished work of art. I think what to say then in for unreleased work, right? I don't have any problem calling that art just because I don't have a problem calling lots of things art. Um, but I think to say is that those are works of art whose status as finished or not, we can't know for sure, which then means it's unclear how to engage with those things.
But do they still occupy that higher category?
Oh, that's okay, gotcha. Um, So I think that if Stevenson and Margolis are right, then simply by producing a work of art, you've also created that higher order category. It's just like an offshoot, right? That you don't may not realize you're doing it, but you've done it, right? And so P.D. Magnus in his paper suggests that in producing Kind of Blue, right, Miles Davis may have also unintentionally created this higher order type, which this other group can then produce a version of,
Mhm.
right? Yeah.
And then a sort of follow-up question there from Nick. So do we have to accept that there is such a thing as a transcendental work? What if we let go of that category altogether?
Yeah.
Would that be helpful for these problems? Would it even be wise?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And that's precisely the thing I'm grappling with right now is whether I want to go this route with the ontology, right? Because in terms of parsimony, it seems like we don't want to overpopulate our ontology with types of things that maybe aren't helpful. And so that's precisely what I'm trying to think of right now, right? And so one direction to go is Guy Rohrbaugh's way of pointing out that all works of art are things that change and evolve over time.
Yeah.
Right. And so, okay, fine. But then what's the nature of that metaphysically? Right. And I argue against his view in my chapter. I just find it problematic that, yeah, artworks are things that change and evolve over time. But by recording them, you've in some sense fixed it. And so you now have one version, then you have a later version, and you have a later version. And in a sense, those are distinct works of art. But then how do we cash out their relationship to one another? And the suggestion of this higher order work of art, of which each of them is a version, which each of them is pointing us towards and giving us access to, right, is the direction I'm wanting to go in. But again, I'm not sure whether that's the view that I absolutely want to ultimately endorse. It's just something I've been thinking about recently.
Well, I hope this has provided you with the opportunity to think through those things and see the kind of responses that you get. And particularly, I think that fan piece as well, where that
Yeah.
comes into it, which appeared on your list as well, in the rise of fan fiction and where that will go. I don't see any more questions coming through on the Q&A. So I am just going to reference a link that's in the chat, which gives you the opportunity to read the opening pages of the book, that introduction, that preface, understand how it came about. You learn more about the contributors and those various different readings of the re-recordings. But I think that's everything. Thank you so much, Brandon. That's provided a lot of it's going to be very difficult to listen to her songs again and think about them in the ways that I did. I really enjoy thinking about this project, and thank you for taking the time.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Colleen. Thanks, Nick.